Hello and welcome to the environment before, during and after the completion of the program presentation. So a little bit of background of myself. I'm currently working as the Site and Operations Manager for a junior company based out of Sparwood, BC, just in the southeast corner, called North Coal. My previous experience includes working on various mines and projects in Australia and in Canada, primarily as a geologist. So I've experienced in a wide variety of outdoor settings and environments. My current role I'm still involved in the planning and executing of our exploration programs. However, my role is more focused in the environmental realm at this time, focusing mainly on project managing our ongoing environmental monitoring program, as well as general land management. Okay, let's get started. During today's presentation, I will cover why we should consider the environment and exploration, First Nations and land, planning, permitting and licenses, camp fuel and waste management, drill pad management, access road management, reclamation and deactivation, and what environmental studies are generally carried out when developing an exploration program and into permitting. So why should we, as project managers, consider environmental aspects in exploration? The environment is an integral foundation to achieving the overall exploration project objectives. The company, including supervisors, are legislatively required to protect workers, the public, and the environment. There are also internal company benefits, with a healthy, happy workforce being more productive. Why else should we, as project managers, consider environmental aspects in exploration? It's your personal reputation, the reputation of the company that you represent, as well as the industry that you're part of. Perception can mean everything when you are developing a project. Companies wishing to acquire exploration assets and who fund project development want companies who practice good ESG practices. And this is becoming increasingly critical from a strategic and marketing perspective. In case you haven't heard of it, ESG is the acronym for environmental, social, and governance. These are three broad categories or areas of interest for what is termed socially responsible investors. So the environment can include items such as climate change, biodiversity, waste, water and resource use, pollution. And social can include items such as human rights, labour practices, safety, health, community, and diversity. And governance can include things such as corporate governance, company ethics or corporate ethics, compliance, and also diversity. So in addition to the financial benefits of strong environmental management, other benefits can include a good relationship with regulators. This will help your ability to obtain permits. Without these, you'll not be able to develop a project. And also good relationships with stakeholders and First Nations, which is also crucial. So planning. There are many types of planning tools out there which you can utilize for project planning. A model that I have found effective is the Plan, Do, Check, Act model, or PDCA. This one is shown here on the left. This model can be used for project planning, implementation, and monitoring. It focuses on continuous improvement of processes, and as you can see, it runs in a continuous circular loop. This model can be applied to all phases of the exploration program. So the plan point is this is where you want to determine your goals, objectives, and targets, and establish the methods in which you plan on achieving them. Doing is implementing the items from the planning stage. This includes worker training. You want to check. The check step is the evaluation of the implementation. Perform reviews and audits of items or processes in the implementation phase. And then act. You want to take appropriate action from the review, apply corrective actions to improve. So this is continuous, so just continually run through the cycle. So planning First Nations and land. Having a good working relationship with local First Nations is critical to project development, not only in the planning stages, but in all stages of a project. We want to consult and plan in conjunction with local First Nations on traditional and current fishing areas, preference and access, types of animals trapped and hunted, abundance and quality of animals, traditional and current trap lines and hunting areas, planting, harvesting and gathering species, sites and overall experience, cultural, spiritual and sacred activities and sites, camping sites, as well as traditional travel on traditional routes. These can include land and water. And also, one of the most important things for you to consider when managing an exploration program is the legislation in which you're required to operate under. This applies to all phases of exploration, before, during, and after. The Mines Act and accompanying Health and Safety Reclamation Code for mines in BC dictates both active mining and exploration in BC. This is one document you should become very familiar with. The HSRC has been discussed throughout previous presentations and will be discussed in more detail in the presentation that follows this one. So I won't go into detail about how it applies here, but we'll mention it as it is very important. In addition to the Mines Act and the BC Health and Safety Reclamation Code, be aware of other pieces of legislation that may be relevant to your work, such as the Water Sustainability Act, Wildfire Act, Wildlife Act, or occupational health and safety regulations in BC. So remember to consult the relevant legislation to ensure compliance when planning your project. So before you start the permitting process, you'll need to know the scope of work and schedule. You will need to apply for a multi-year area-based permit, otherwise known as a MIAB. MIAB permitting is the practice of authorizing exploration activity, typically for up to 5 years within an identified activity area, underlain by a mineral or coal tenure of the project. You will also need to know the location and rough size of access roads, trails, helipads, airstrips, with an estimation of how much disturbance that you're likely to undertake. You'll also need to know what your water use will be. Will you require water for drilling or a camp? Do you cross any water bodies? Are you using a water source, or are you near a water body that's likely to be impacted by your activity? Timber cutting, you may need a free use permit or occupant license to cut. However, something else to consider with timber harvesting or cutting is that make sure that someone else hold the surface rights where you're undertaking exploration. If they do, be cautious about cutting any timber down, as it may cost you money. You also need to be aware of how you're going to be transporting equipment and people to and from your worksite. Does it involve helicopter work where there may be restrictions? For example, you may require a caribou management plan, which places work restrictions during May and June. What is the anticipated length of the program? Do you have the appropriate licenses for the area that you are undertaking exploration? And if necessary, do you have land agreements and third-party permits in place? Do you have a land agreement in place if you're operating on private land, and or any other environmental permits, such as a motor vehicle closed area permit, otherwise known as an access management area permit, which limits motorized access to certain areas of land. So when working in a remote location, management of a camp will need to be considered. This will include fuel and waste management. When planning a work camp, consider hiring a professional to help plan and build your camp. What are the first aid requirements for your work situation? Ensure that you have the appropriate level of first aid, the location, and the amount of workers. Engage a knowledgeable camp manager. Hire someone with experience in these kind of work settings. And considerations for your camp location. What are the access and egress options? Is it near water? Where will your source of drinking water be? What will you do with the wastewater from your camp or drill rig? As well as septic considerations. Where will the waste go? And consider where other waste generators, such as domestic garbage, will be stored and disposed of. Fuel and hazardous materials management. Make sure you have a spill management plan in place and spill equipment is in place. Have a spill response plan in place and train all workers on fueling procedures and what to do in the event of a spill. Ensure that there are spill kits available for the amount and type of substance being used and that they are readily available. And have the appropriate level of training and preparedness in place, including an emergency response plan, standard operating procedures, and run practice drills whenever possible to test procedures that are in place. So double wall tanks and secondary containment for fuel sources should be used with secondary containment for hazardous substances. Substances should be stored on a spill tray, much like the one pictured here, to contain any possible leakage. Use best practices when handling hazardous substances, such as two people when fueling equipment. Implement a monitoring process for supervisors to check hazardous substance use and storage for compliance at the worksite. And you also want to know what the reporting requirements are. When to report incidents to the authorities under the BC spill reporting regulation. Spills must be reported if the spill enters or is likely to enter a body of water, or the quantity of the substance spilled or is likely to be equal to or greater than the listed quantity for the listed substance. Drill pad management. Our goal with drill pad management is to keep disturbance and impact to the surrounding environment to a minimum. You want to do this by using existing roads and pads whenever possible. There are other things to consider as well. You want to know the riparian setback from lakes, creeks, wetlands. Ensure that the pads and roads will not build too close to a water body. Know the terrain and plan accordingly. This may affect your drainage design or type. Measures should be taken to manage the flow of drilling discharge and minimize the impact on streams, wetlands, or lakes. Effective sump location and construction. Ensure that sumps and drainage systems will be fit for purpose. So if you are drilling deep holes, these may require bigger sumps, and you want to install graduated sumps staggered downhill to aid in filtering out suspended particles. If sumps are not possible, use silt fencing, landscape cloth or geotextile, straw or hay bales, or cross-piled logs. However, it is important to note to be careful with straw bales or hay bales as they can introduce invasive plant species into the area. You may have to get certified weed-free bales. These can be significantly more expensive. And any felled trees should be stacked to the side. Once again, if you're operating on private land where another party owns the timber rights, be careful about felling harvestable trees. Slash and felled trees can be used later in reclamation as well. So you want to inspect any trails or pads after construction to ensure that they are built to an appropriate size and standard. Address any concerns as soon as possible. Also inspect pads after completion of drilling to confirm that there is no garbage or flowing water at the location. After a drill hole has been completed, it is important to monitor it for artesian or flowing groundwater. Groundwater shall not be permitted to flow from a completed drill hole without written authorization of an inspector. This is in the Health and Safety Reclamation Code. So flowing holes may need to be plugged. Access road management. If you require roads or trails during your exploration program, you will need to ensure that they're compliant with appropriate legislation and that you're constructing and maintaining them well. You're going to create and follow a sediment erosion plan and conduct ongoing maintenance with experienced road building contractors. This is to ensure that you're not creating an increase of sedimentation into waterways. You want to monitor your roads year round. In spring, you may need to restrict road traffic due to the soft conditions of the road. In summer, you may need to control the dust with suppressants such as water. In fall, you want to prepare for freeze thaw or wet, rainy weather. And in winter, if you're operating during the winter, you obviously need to plow and maintain the roads. You're going to proactively manage the water with culverts, corduroy, gravel, and properly designed water bars. These may need to be maintained after significant melt or rainfall events. I conduct an inspection of all of our trails in the spring after freshet to ensure that there are no issues from the winter and that drainage systems are working properly. So after the completion of exploration, the worksite will still need to be either deactivated or reclaimed. It depends on whether or not exploration has ceased permanently. So what's the difference between deactivation and reclamation? Deactivation refers to leaving a site or area in a hydrologically and geotechnically stable state. However, access may still exist for smaller vehicles, such as side-by-sides, pods, and possibly pickup trucks. Whereas reclamation refers to the returning of the land to a state similar to what it was pre-disturbance. So deactivation includes stabilization of the exploration site, access road and prism and clearing widths, restoration or maintenance of drainage patterns, minimization of soil erosion to the extent practical. Ongoing erosion control may be required. So the hay bales, silt screen or logs, if it's happening regularly. Any drill holes that are visible at the surface should be marked, picketed and labeled. And you want to ensure that all garbage is removed, sumps are filled in and the pads are resloped to assist in drainage. This reclamation consists of restoration of drainage patterns and recontouring of the land, removal of bridge structures and culverts, ensuring a surface is stable in a way that minimizes future erosion, as well as the establishment of self-sustaining vegetation appropriate for the site, which may include reforestation. You want to pull back organics such as slash or felled trees to aid in vegetation growth. As you can see in the middle picture here, we place slash along a reclaimed trail and that will help trap seeds for future growth. And you also want to take care not to introduce non-native species to the reclamation site when revegetating. So ensure that you are revegetating it with something appropriate for the area. This is also a time you might want to get First Nations involved because they may have a preference for types of vegetation. So what are the benefits of revegetation? So to improve the overall aesthetics of the site, obviously something that has plant life on it looks a bit better than a brown bare slope, but it also increases ground stability. To enhance natural vegetation growth, so any vegetation will help create environment for new vegetation, and to avoid or prevent migration of non-native invasive plant species, which can have an adverse effect on the surrounding ecosystem. You can help prevent the spread of these invasive plant species by pressure washing drills or equipment before coming to site. Or if you're moving between different sites, you can also do a visual inspection of vehicles and equipment when moving between work areas or sites to ensure that there are no weeds being transported in tyres in the undercarriage or mud on the surface. So as a side note, when doing any sort of deactivation, reclamation or revegetation, remember to take before and after photos of the work that has been done. Repeating photos annually can also be useful for documenting how well revegetation efforts have worked, and write as many details as possible down, such as the size of the area worked on, dates, and equipment used. Whenever we perform reclamation, I always write up a reclamation report, which specifies the work done. And you may be able to receive some of your reclamation bond back. So it is important to be as detailed as possible. So that's environmental studies. So why do we do environmental studies? These are often conducted during all stages of a project. Baseline studies describe natural environments prior to development. So these studies can help to define the best location for project facilities or equipment, as well as avoiding any areas where species at risk or endangered wildlife may be. So facilitate the assessment of potential project environmental effects. Facilitate development of appropriate mitigation and management measures to avoid or reduce the identified potential environmental effects, as well as to establish benchmarks for ongoing monitoring programs. Also helps with sharing of information with communities and government. Workers on site should also report any wildlife sightings or encounters to their supervisor or manager and be aware of the locations where the species at risk have been identified. So what kind of baseline studies do we have? We have biological studies or terrestrial baseline studies. The aim of these studies is to identify terrestrial habitat and populations, baseline soil quality, as well as identify any protected and site-specific sensitive species, both plant and animal. Studies are planned according to season and may be dependent on breeding, winter track counts, migrations, and flowering plants. Surveys may include plant community, breeding of marsh bird, amphibian and reptile, and mammal. The data from these studies can inform us of construction timing, the location of facilities, and assess the potential project impact on terrestrial species. Aquatic baseline studies. These are carried out to identify fish and benthic habitat and populations and identify any protected and site-specific sensitive areas that may be present. These baseline studies are geographically scoped to be wider than the project footprint to capture habitat and travel migration paths, so upstream, downstream, reference locations. Aquatic studies combined with project design could affect work in water bodies and effluent criteria depending on species present or trigger habitat enhancement or compensation requirements. So the next environmental study or studies that receive a lot of attention in any project are studies carried out on water. I'll briefly explain what each of these are and why they are important. The first being hydrology or water quantity studies. These describe baseline conditions of water flow and direction. Hydrological measurements can be taken via continuous monitoring equipment permanently installed in waterways or using manual flow measurements measured by personnel in the field. A robust hydrological record requires at least 1 year of data to get a complete picture of how a body of water changes over the seasons, particularly low and high flow periods. Data uses from hydrology include establishing a site water balance, evaluating the effects of the project on water balance, as well as being used in engineering design, so the location of facilities. Other type of water studies, water quality. So water quality monitors constituents within a body of water, establishes water quality prior to development. So as with hydrology, water quality requires a minimum of 1 year of continuous data for surface water. Water needs to be sampled on a monthly or seasonal basis, spring, summer, fall, and winter. You need to consider the location, methods, frequency, parameters, and low-level detection limits of your project. Water quality data can be used to predict water quality changes as a result of project development and help to define what the treatment requirements may be, as well as informing project design and choices for special mitigations. The last type of water monitoring that I'm going to mention is hydrogeology. Hydrogeology is the study of groundwater. So you'll often hear them interchangeably, the hydrogeology or groundwater. So this hydrogeology deals with how water gets into the ground. how it flows in the subsurface, and how groundwater interacts with the surrounding soil and rock. Hydrogeology data is collected using groundwater wells, which are drilled to a variety of depths, depending on the target, and have continuous monitoring equipment installed similar to those of surface hydrology wells. This equipment measures groundwater elevation, which can be used in conjunction with hydrology to ascertain surface water groundwater interactions. It also measures groundwater flow rates and directions. This data can then be used in the design phase for foundations, dewatering, and locations of facilities. And not to forget climatic studies. Meteorological stations may be installed to measure wind speed and direction, precipitation, rainfall and snow, temperature, relative humidity, pressure, and evaporation. The data from meteorological stations can be used to help determine the potential impact that a project may have on the air quality of the surrounding environment, as well as influence project design of infrastructure and buildings. And on a little side note, you want to make sure that any equipment that you're installing is compliant with any standards in place for the data that you're capturing. For example, you may need to have the wind turbine at a minimum height for the data to be valid. And last but not least, wildlife studies and animal management. So we need to conduct wildlife monitoring to determine what animals are residing within your project area. Wildlife monitoring can either be classified as active or passive. Active monitoring consists of counting of animals and animal signs, whereas passive monitoring is through things like trail cameras. This data can be then processed at a later date and can include information such as animal identification, count, as well as direction. No pets should be allowed whilst working on an exploration site. However, a carefully managed dog can be considered for safety. This will depend on the company that you're working for, so check to see what their policies are. And with any wild animal, do not ever feed a wild animal. Ensure that waste is properly disposed of appropriately and that animals are not being attracted to your work site. Do not cut trees in nesting season of birds. Know where the nesting locations are likely to be, and you'll get these from your terrestrial studies, and where endangered birds may be located. Do not work in streams in spawning season. You want to prevent siltation at all times. Causing a significant increase in sedimentation in waterways is a serious offence. It's actually a federal offence. Monitor endangered animals and you want to record sightings. And finally, engage with local experts and Indigenous people as much as possible. They may have insight on what animals are in the area and what you should look out for. Thanks for listening. That's all from me.